Hi. Okay, now I'm going to tell you just very, very briefly about why it is Goldman in 1976 comes to reject the causal theory that I just explained. So um, he talks in the opening of the paper about this case, which he attributes to Carl Genet. So imagine this: you're driving through the countryside. Um, you are looking around and forming beliefs about the structures and animals and things that you see from the road. Um, in Goldman's version of the example, you are pointing these things out and naming them to your child. There's a fence, there's a farmhouse, there's a barn, there's a cow, there's a horse, etc. Okay. Focus in on your belief about the barn that you point out. You point at something and you say, that's a barn. You are good at recognizing barns from this distance on the road. You were once a child and you learned these things then. Uh, you recognize this thing as a barn. You say, that's a barn. You are, in fact, correct. Everything looks fine. If we apply Goldman's causal theory, the 1967 one, we'd say everything's fine, right? You point your eyes at a barn. The fact that it's a barn causes you to believe that it's a barn. We wind up with a diagram that looks like this. It's just like the ones we've seen before. There's a causal arrow. Because it's a barn, you come to believe that it's a barn. So Goldman thinks his causal theory has to tell you that you know that this is a barn. Okay, now let me tweak the case. Let me add a little bit more context. I didn't mention these things before. None of the things that I told you about this story so far are false. I'm not changing anything that I said. I'm adding more information. Here's some more information about the case. Um, think about the surrounding countryside with more farms and more barns, more things that you would have looked from the road to see and said, that's a barn. Things that maybe look identical to the original barn from the road. Okay, if you had pointed at any one of those barns rather than the one you picked, you would have said, that's a barn. And you would have been wrong because they're all fakes. You just happened by chance to have pointed at the one fake barn in this entire area. This whole region is full of, for some reason, fake barns. They just have like one side. Like, as far as you can see from the road, they look very convincingly like barns, but in fact, they aren't. Okay, Goldman says, in this case, clearly, intuitively, this is not a case of knowledge. Even though you're pointing at the one real barn, you don't really know. I'm going to put some words in his mouth. He doesn't say this, but we could say, you're just lucky that your belief is true. The evidence that you have, or if you like, the process you use to form your belief, is not reliable in this environment, right? If you just go by using your normal perceptual from the road ability to distinguish, to discern, to discriminate barns from not barns, that process is usually going to be wrong here. Usually you're going to look at things that are not barns and say, that's a barn. Or rather, I should say, usually when you would say that's a barn, you'll be wrong. Okay. Goldman says, I have to admit, my causal theory is going to get this case wrong. It's going to get the verdict I don't want. It's going to tell you that as long as you're looking at a real barn, and your belief that it's a barn is caused by its actually being a barn, well, it's caused by it looking like a barn. Why does it look like a barn? It looks like a barn because it is a barn. What causes it to look that way is the fact that it's a barn. My causal theory is going to say everything's fine here. I need to appeal to something else that's wrong about this case. That's what he thinks. I do want you to think about whether you agree with his intuition. There are some philosophers who agree and some who disagree. Those of you who have been in tutorial will have heard me say, I don't have intuitions that I personally trust. I didn't run into this case. I hadn't heard about it until after I had formed an opinion about what I think is the right thing to do with the analysis of knowledge. I'm not sure I'm committed to that anymore, but I just don't trust my intuitions about this. However, Goldman clearly reports the intuition that this is not knowledge. In your reading this week from William Lycan, he reports, I have the intuition that it is knowledge. There are other philosophers who have said other things. My impression is in the immediate aftermath of Goldman talking about this case in sort of the late 70s and through the 80s, most people said that most philosophers who published anything said this is clearly intuitively not knowledge. They agreed with Goldman. Lycan suggests more and more people by the time we got around to this century started coming out with contrary opinions. Surveys may have been done about this. I don't know. But okay, if you share Goldman's intuition that this is not a case of knowledge, then even if you liked the causal theory of knowledge, and Goldman still thinks there's something right in there, we need to find a way to tweak the theory so that we can say this is not a case of knowledge. So we need to find a way to make those fake barns in the surrounding farms relevant to the question whether you know that you're looking at a barn when in fact you are looking at a barn. They aren't part of the causal story. They aren't part of the story of what causes your belief. So the old theory can't handle it. Now, here's what Goldman thinks was right about the causal theory. The causal theory was right to shift our focus from just what justifies your belief, from just like how you reason toward it, what reasons you could give in support of it. Shift our focus from that towards what's the actual process that causes your beliefs. So in that causal theory's story, there is something in here about your reasoning, and we do want these dashed arrows to represent like good, justified reasoning. But it also matters, well, not just what causes the fact, like this is a story about what's out in the world, but also what causes certain of your beliefs. We need this link between some fact in the world and your belief that that fact is true, typically through perception, but not necessarily. Okay, so Goldman thinks really what we should do, I was right to say let's focus on the processes causing our beliefs. But instead of just saying, is your belief appropriately causally connected to the fact that it's about, we should ask, is that process reliable? So we get a view called reliabilism out of this. We want to ask, forming beliefs in this way, is that a reliable, or I'll use this word, Goldman doesn't, a trustworthy way of forming true beliefs? Is this something that's going to get us truth rather than falsehood? Okay, I'm framing that extremely generally, and Goldman does frame these things quite generally in the paper. He does get into some nitty-gritty details, but it doesn't get super precise because we want, here are some difficult questions for reliabilists. How reliable is reliable enough? We probably don't want to say that you only have knowledge if your beliefs are produced by a process that is guaranteed to produce true beliefs, because that's going to threaten to turn us back into infallibilists. We're in the fallibilism week here. We're in the fallibilism period of the history of Western epistemology, because we're worried that requiring infallibilism is going to lead to skepticism. And skepticism, we think, is no good. We're role-playing as philosophers who think those things for this week. Okay, that's one problem. How reliable is it reliable enough? Where do we set the bar? Somewhere. Maybe that's answerable, but it might take work. Second question, how do you identify what counts as the process that produced your belief? This is something called the generality problem, and there's lots been written about it. Put it this way. So Goldman wants to say the reason why your belief in the fake barn case isn't knowledge is because the process producing your belief isn't reliable. What's the process that produces your belief? Well, maybe something like perception from the road at a certain distance in this county, in this area, in this region where there's lots of fake barns around. That process described that way does seem pretty unreliable, right? Usually when you point your beliefs, point your eyes, point your perceptual apparatus at apparent barns, you wind up believing that there's a barn there, and that turns out to be false. But we could describe the process that produces your belief more generally. We could say, well, what's the process? It's visual perception. And usually the beliefs produced by your visual perception are true. Or we could say, what's the process you're using? It's trying to recognize farm structures from the road at this distance by eyesight anywhere in the world. And in most places, you're reliable about those things. It's just this one weird area where that thing doesn't quite work. Or we might be more specific. We might say, well, what's the process you're using? It's using visual inspection of this one barn from this distance. And in that case, the system is reliable because this is a real barn. And when you look at it and you think that's a real barn, you're right. Okay. So reliabilists have to find a way they have to be more specific. This is not a refutation of the view. This is the kind of objection that says you need to give us more detail in order to get the cases right the way you want them. So you need to give us a way of determining, ideally not in an ad hoc kind of way, just a case by case, guided by the verdicts we want to get. In a general kind of way, a principled kind of way, you need to tell us how to specify what the process is, the process that produces your belief, the thing that we're evaluating for its reliability. Or if you like, how to decide what counts as the environment in which you're using that process. Should we construe it as the environment of just looking at this barn, of looking at barns in this county, the environment of using it under certain lighting conditions, no matter where in the world you are? What? How do we decide those things? Okay. I'm going to leave it there. Yeah, you should grapple with the paper and see if you can understand what Goldman is doing as he tries to give some, but not a lot of those details. Get stuck. Some parts of it are hard. That's okay. The way you become able to do hard things is you try to do them and you fail and you ask for help. So send me email, bring questions to the drop-in sessions, bring questions to tutorial. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.